If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1, The Making of a Leader, 1732 to 1758. Part 1, Birth and Early Years in Virginia, 1732 to 1749. A cold February morning in 1732 changed the course of American history, though nobody could have known it then. At Pope's Creek Plantation in Colonial, Virginia, Mary Ball Washington gave birth to a son she named George. The baby entered a world of rigid social order, where wealthy planters ruled vast estates worked by enslaved people, and where your family name determined your future. George's childhood unfolded in this structured society. His father, Augustine Washington, owned several plantations and moved the family frequently between properties. The boy learned early that land meant power and status in Virginia. But when George was just 11 years old, tragedy struck. Augustine died suddenly, leaving the family's future uncertain. The loss changed everything for young George. His older half-brothers inherited the best properties, while George and his younger siblings faced a more modest future. His mother, Mary, now a widow, had to manage what remained of the estate while raising her children. She was a strong woman who demanded discipline and hard work from her sons. Unlike wealthy Virginia boys who sailed to England for classical education, George learned practical skills. He studied basic mathematics, read history books, and practiced his handwriting until it was precise and clear. Most importantly, he learned surveying, the art of measuring and mapping land. This skill would prove more valuable than any fancy education. At 14, George considered joining the Royal Navy, but his mother refused to let him go. Instead, he found work as a surveyor's assistant. The job took him into Virginia's wild frontier, where he learned to read landscapes, deal with rough settlers, and negotiate with Native American tribes who still claimed much of the territory. The work was dangerous and demanding. George spent weeks camping in forests, crossing rivers, and climbing mountains to map new settlements. He learned to handle difficult people, make quick decisions, and solve problems with limited resources. Each survey taught him more about leadership and survival. Through his half-brother Lawrence, who had married into the wealthy Fairfax family, George met Virginia's most powerful men. At Mount Vernon, Lawrence's estate, the young surveyor listened to conversations about politics, land speculation, and colonial affairs. These connections opened doors that his modest education never could have. By 17, George had earned his surveyor's license and begun accumulating his own land. He bought property in the Shenandoah Valley and continued expanding westward. Each purchase demonstrated his growing understanding of how wealth and influence worked in colonial America. The boy who had lost his father's inheritance was creating his own path to prominence. His years measuring wilderness boundaries had taught him patience, precision, and the value of preparation. These lessons, learned in Virginia's forests and drawing rooms, would soon face their greatest test as colonial tensions with Britain began to simmer. Part 2, The Virginia Frontier and Military Beginnings, 1750 to 1753. The comfortable world of surveying and land acquisition that had defined Washington's early 20s suddenly shifted in 1750 when imperial tensions reached Virginia's doorstep. Britain and France had been circling each other like wary dogs for years, but now their rivalry focused on the Ohio River Valley. This fertile region promised enormous wealth through trade and settlement, making it too valuable for either empire to ignore. Governor Robert Dinwiddie recognized that Virginia's western claims hung in the balance. The French had begun building forts throughout the disputed territory, essentially drawing a line in the wilderness and daring the British to cross it. Dinwiddie needed someone reliable to carry an official message to the French commanders, demanding they withdraw from lands Britain considered its own. The mission required someone young enough to endure harsh travel experienced enough to navigate frontier dangers, and diplomatic enough to avoid starting a war accidentally. Washington's reputation as a capable surveyor made him an obvious choice. At 21, he possessed the frontier skills necessary for such a journey, plus the social standing to represent Virginia's interests credibly. When Dinwiddie offered him the assignment in October 1753, Washington accepted immediately. The mission would take him deep into contested territory during winter months, through landscapes where every decision could mean life or death. The expedition began at Alexandria and wound northwest through increasingly wild country. Washington's small party included a translator, several guides, and Christopher Gist, an experienced frontiersman who knew the territory intimately. They traveled on horseback through dense forests, across swollen rivers, and over mountain ridges already dusted with early snow. Each day brought new challenges as temperatures dropped and the landscape became more forbidding. Washington's discovered quickly that frontier diplomacy involved far more than delivering messages. Native tribes held the balance of power in this region, and both French and British forces competed desperately for their allegiance. At Logstown, Washington met with tribal leaders who listened politely but revealed little about their intentions. He learned to read the subtle signs of shifting loyalties and began understanding how European conflicts played out differently in American forests. The French reception proved courteous but firm. At Fort Le Boeuf, the commanders treated Washington with military respect while making their position crystal clear. They had no intention of abandoning their claims to the Ohio Valley. The young Virginian found himself face-to-face with experienced officers who viewed him as merely another ambitious colonial. Yet he maintained his composure, delivered his message officially, and gathered valuable intelligence about French military preparations. The return journey nearly killed him. Winter weather turned brutal, forcing the party to abandon their horses and continue on foot. Washington fell into an icy river, survived an attempt on his life by a hostile guide, and spent a freezing night on an island in the Allegheny River. These experiences stripped away any romantic notions about frontier adventure, replacing them with hard-won knowledge about survival, leadership under pressure, and the deadly serious nature of imperial competition. When Washington finally reached Williamsburg in January 1754, his detailed report impressed colonial authorities throughout Virginia and beyond. His mission had failed diplomatically, but succeeded spectacularly in establishing his reputation. Here was a young man who could combine military bearing with practical intelligence, someone who understood both the drawing rooms of Virginia society and the harsh realities of contested wilderness. The lessons learned during this mission would shape Washington's entire approach to leadership. He had seen how preparation and adaptability could mean the difference between success and disaster. He understood now that effective command required not just courage, but careful observation, detailed planning, and the ability to make crucial decisions with incomplete information. As spring arrived in 1754, everyone recognized that diplomacy had failed completely. The French remained entrenched in the Ohio Valley. British colonial interests demanded action, and Virginia's young messenger would soon find himself leading men into battle rather than carrying messages between opposing forces. Part 3. Skirmishes and the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1758. The spring of 1754 brought young George Washington face to face with the brutal realities of warfare. At 22, he found himself leading a small Virginia force westward toward Fort Duquesne, where French soldiers had established a stronghold in the contested Ohio Valley. The mission seemed straightforward: drive out the French and secure British claims to this valuable territory. On a foggy morning in May, Washington's men encountered a French patrol at Jumonville Glen. What happened next would echo across continents. In the confusion of the skirmish, French officer Ensign Jumonville lay dead, struck down in circumstances that remain disputed to this day. Washington had fired what many consider the opening shots of a global war. Colonial newspapers celebrated the victory, but the young commander sensed darker consequences approaching. Those consequences arrived swiftly. French forces, seeking revenge for Jumonville's death, advanced toward Washington's hastily constructed Fort Necessity. Built in a low, marshy meadow, the fort proved woefully inadequate when hundreds of French soldiers and their Native American allies surrounded it on July 3, 1754. Rain turned the ground to mud as bullets whistled through the crude palisades. Washington faced his first devastating military defeat. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, he was forced to surrender. The terms were humiliating, requiring him to sign a document that essentially admitted to assassinating Jumonville. Walking away from Fort Necessity, Washington carried the bitter taste of failure and the weight of having inadvertently triggered an international conflict. Yet this defeat became a crucible that forged his character. When General Edward Braddock arrived from Britain in 1755 with professional soldiers to capture Fort Duquesne, Washington served as his aide-de-camp. He watched in horror as Braddock's rigid European tactics collapsed against French and Native American guerrilla warfare. As bullets tore through the British ranks and Braddock fell mortally wounded, Washington rallied the surviving troops, organizing their retreat and saving hundreds of lives. The years that followed taught Washington harsh lessons about frontier combat. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of wilderness. Militia units arrived and departed according to harvest schedules rather than military necessity. Native American tribes shifted allegiances based on immediate advantages rather than distant promises. Washington learned to adapt, to plan meticulously, and to lead by example rather than rank alone. By 1758, when British forces finally captured Fort Duquesne and renamed it Fort Pitt, Washington had transformed from an eager young officer into a seasoned commander. He understood that successful military leadership required not just courage, but careful logistics, diplomatic skill, and the ability to maintain morale during extended campaigns. These 4 years of warfare provided Washington with invaluable experience in coordinating with other colonial forces, managing diverse personalities under stress, and maintaining discipline among civilian soldiers. The intercolonial cooperation required during these campaigns offered him an early glimpse of American unity that would later prove essential. As the French and Indian War drew to a close, Washington returned to Virginia, carrying lessons that would shape his approach to command for the rest of his life. Part 4. Transition to Civilian Life and Mount Vernon Estate, 1759. The spring of 1759 marked a dramatic shift in Washington's life, as the young colonel hung up his military uniform and turned toward the domestic world of Mount Vernon. The battles and hardships of the French and Indian War had forged him into a seasoned leader, but now a different kind of challenge awaited him. On January 6, 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow whose vast holdings would transform his financial standing overnight. Martha brought more than companionship to the union. Her estates included thousands of acres, dozens of slaves, and substantial monetary assets from her first husband's death. This marriage elevated Washington from a moderately successful planter to one of Virginia's wealthiest men. The responsibility was immense, but Washington approached it with the same methodical discipline he had learned commanding troops. At Mount Vernon, Washington became a different kind of general. He rose before dawn, inspected his fields like a military commander reviewing battle lines, and maintained detailed records of everything from crop yields to weather patterns. The organizational skills honed during years of managing soldiers now served him well in coordinating the labor of hundreds of workers across thousands of acres. Washington quickly realized that Virginia's traditional tobacco economy had serious flaws. Market prices fluctuated wildly. The crop depleted soil nutrients, and planters remained perpetually indebted to British merchants. With characteristic boldness, he began shifting Mount Vernon's production toward wheat, a crop that could be sold locally and provided more stable returns. He established a flour mill, expanded his fisheries on the Potomac River, and invested in western lands that promised future profits. The political world also beckoned. Washington won election to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1758, beginning a career in public service that would span decades. Initially, he spoke little during legislative sessions, preferring to observe and learn. His military reputation commanded respect. But Washington understood that political leadership required different skills than battlefield command. In the Assembly, Washington built relationships with influential planters, lawyers, and merchants. He served on committees, studied legislation carefully, and gradually gained confidence in public speaking. These experiences taught him the art of compromise, the importance of building coalitions, and the complex process of turning ideas into laws. Mount Vernon became more than just a plantation during these years. Washington's reputation for honesty and sound judgment made his estate a gathering place for Virginia's political elite. Important conversations about colonial rights, British policies, and American interests often took place around his dining table. These discussions would prove invaluable as imperial tensions escalated in the coming decade. By the mid-1760s, Washington had successfully transformed himself from a military officer into a respected civilian leader. His business ventures flourished, his political influence grew, and his social standing reached new heights. The administrative skills, personal networks, and public credibility he developed during this period would soon face their greatest test as revolution approached. Chapter 2. Leading a Revolution, 1774 to 1783. Part 1. From Colonial Delegate to Commander-in-Chief, 1774 to 1775. By the early 1770s, anger simmered across the American colonies like water about to boil. The British government had imposed tax after tax without giving colonists any voice in Parliament. People felt trapped, forced to pay for laws they had no say in making. George Washington, now a respected planter and politician in Virginia, watched these events with growing concern. In 1774, colonial leaders decided they needed to meet and talk about their problems together. They chose Washington as one of Virginia's representatives to this gathering, called the First Continental Congress. He packed his bags and traveled to Philadelphia, where delegates from different colonies would try to find a solution to their troubles with Britain. Washington still hoped they could work things out peacefully. He believed strongly in colonial rights, but he also knew that fighting the British Empire would be incredibly dangerous. During the meetings, he listened carefully and spoke thoughtfully about what the colonies should do next. His military experience from the French and Indian War made other delegates respect his opinions about defense and strategy. But events moved faster than anyone expected. In April 1775, British soldiers and colonial militia clashed at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. Shots were fired. Men died. The conflict everyone had feared was now real. When news of the fighting reached Philadelphia, everything changed. The Second Continental Congress gathered quickly to decide what to do next. They realized they needed an army, and that army needed a leader. The delegates looked around the room, considering who could take on such an enormous responsibility. Washington's name came up immediately. He had military experience, but more importantly, he carried himself with quiet dignity that inspired confidence. When he walked into Congress wearing his blue and buff military uniform, he sent a clear message about his readiness to serve. The delegates voted unanimously to make him Commander-in-Chief of the new Continental Army. Washington accepted the position reluctantly. He understood exactly what he was agreeing to do. He would have to take poorly trained farmers and shopkeepers and somehow turn them into soldiers capable of fighting the most powerful army in the world. The British had professional troops, the best equipment money could buy, and a navy that ruled the seas. His appointment meant more than just military leadership. It showed that Virginia, the largest and most influential Southern colony, stood firmly with Massachusetts and the other New England colonies in their resistance. This unity sent a powerful message throughout America and across the ocean to Britain. Washington knew his greatest challenge would be creating a real army from the scattered colonial militias. These men were brave and determined, but they lacked the training, supplies, and organization needed for a long war. He would have to forge them into a national fighting force capable of surviving years of conflict against a superior enemy. Part 2. Trials and Triumphs in Early Battles, 1775 to 1777. Washington's first real test as commander came at Boston, where British forces had trapped themselves in the city after Lexington and Concord. The new Continental Army was little more than a collection of colonial militias, each with their own ways of fighting and their own ideas about taking orders. Washington faced the daunting task of turning these independent-minded farmers and tradesmen into soldiers capable of standing against British regulars. The siege dragged on through the winter of 1775 to 76, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Washington knew he needed something dramatic to break the stalemate. When his men captured heavy cannons from Fort Ticonderoga and hauled them through snow and ice across hundreds of miles, Washington saw his opportunity. On a frigid March night in 1776, his soldiers worked in silence to position the artillery on Dorchester Heights, overlooking Boston Harbor. When dawn broke, the British awoke to find enemy cannons pointing down at their ships and positions. General Howe realized his situation was hopeless. Within days, the entire British force evacuated Boston, sailing away with over 1,000 Loyalist colonists. It was Washington's first major victory, and it proved that the Continental Army could force the mighty British Empire to retreat. But success in Boston could not prepare Washington for what came next. The British returned in force to New York, bringing the largest army ever assembled in North America. General Howe commanded over 30,000 district professional soldiers, backed by the world's most powerful navy. Washington had barely half that number. Most of them inexperienced volunteers. The New York campaign became a series of disasters. At the Battle of Long Island, British and Hessian forces crushed Washington's army, killing or capturing over 1,000 men. Only a daring nighttime evacuation across the East River saved the survivors from complete destruction. Week after week, Washington found himself retreating across Manhattan, then into New Jersey, always one step ahead of pursuing enemy forces. By December 1776, the Continental Army was falling apart. Soldiers deserted daily as their enlistments expired. Those who remained were hungry, poorly clothed, and demoralized. The cause of independence seemed lost. Many Americans began to think reconciliation with Britain was their only hope for peace. Washington refused to surrender to despair. On Christmas night, he launched the most audacious gamble of his military career. Leading 2,400 men across the ice-choked Delaware River in a fierce winter storm, he marched 9 miles through snow and sleet to attack Hessian troops at Trenton. The enemy soldiers, recovering from their Christmas celebrations, were caught completely off guard. The battle lasted less than an hour. Washington's men captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, while suffering only a handful of casualties. More importantly, the victory breathed new life into the revolutionary cause. Volunteers began returning to the army, and colonial newspapers proclaimed that the war was far from over. A week later, Washington struck again at Princeton, routing British forces and proving that Trenton was no accident. These victories transformed Washington from a general who had suffered repeated defeats into a symbol of American resilience. He had learned that sometimes survival mattered more than victory. and that knowing when to retreat could be as important as knowing when to attack. Part 3. Winter at Valley Forge and the French Alliance, 1777 to 1778. The winter of 1777 arrived with devastating news for Washington and his army. The defeats at Brandywine and Germantown had crushed any hopes of quick victory, and now his men faced something worse than British bullets. They faced winter itself. Washington chose Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, as winter quarters for his remaining 12,000 soldiers. The location offered strategic advantages, close enough to watch British-occupied Philadelphia, yet far enough to avoid surprise attacks. But the reality of Valley Forge quickly became a nightmare that would test every man's commitment to the revolutionary cause. The soldiers had no proper shelter when they arrived. They slept in the open until they could build crude log huts, 12 men crowded into spaces barely fit for 4. Snow leaked through gaps in the walls. The men's feet left bloody tracks in the snow because they had no shoes. Many wrapped rags around their feet, but even that small comfort was rare. Food became the army's greatest enemy. Soldiers went days without eating, surviving on fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked on stones. Some boiled their leather belts to make soup. Others ate bark from trees. The smell of death hung over the camp as disease killed more men than British weapons ever had. Washington watched his army dissolve before his eyes. Every morning brought new deserters. Every evening brought news of more deaths from cold, hunger, and disease. Local farmers sold their crops to the British for hard currency instead of helping the Continental Army. Even some members of Congress questioned whether Washington should continue as commander. Yet Washington refused to abandon his men or his cause. He walked among the sick and dying, sharing their hardships. He wrote desperate letters to Congress and state governments, begging for supplies that rarely came. Most importantly, he held the army together through sheer force of will and personal example. Then Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived. This Prussian officer had served under Frederick the Great and understood how to transform farmers into soldiers. Through the bitter cold, von Steuben drilled the men relentlessly. He taught them to march in formation, to load their muskets faster, and to fight as a unified force rather than a collection of individuals. The transformation was remarkable. Men who had entered Valley Forge as a defeated rabble began to emerge as a real army. Their movements became crisp and coordinated. Their confidence returned with their competence. Spring brought even better news. Word arrived that American forces under General Gates had won a stunning victory at Saratoga, capturing an entire British army. More importantly, this victory had convinced France to join the war as America's ally. The French alliance changed everything. France brought naval power that could challenge British control of the seas. French ships carried desperately needed supplies, weapons, and money. Perhaps most crucially, France gave the American cause international legitimacy, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global war. As Washington's army marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778, they were no longer the same men who had stumbled in 6 months earlier. They had endured the worst and survived. They had become soldiers worthy of the cause they served. Part 4. Victory at Yorktown and the End of War, 1781 to 1783. By 1781, the war had dragged on for 6 long years. Washington faced a crucial decision that would determine America's fate. The French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, was sailing toward the Chesapeake Bay, offering a rare opportunity to strike a decisive blow. British General Cornwallis had moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, believing he could receive supplies and reinforcements by sea. Washington saw his chance. He needed to coordinate 3 separate forces: his Continental Army, French troops under General Rochambeau, and the French Navy. The timing had to be perfect. If any piece failed, Cornwallis would escape and the war might continue for years. The plan required careful deception. Washington spread false information, suggesting he would attack British-held New York City. He even built fake camps and conducted obvious preparations to make the British believe this was his target. Meanwhile, he secretly prepared to march his entire army 400 miles south to Virginia. In August 1781, Washington began the massive troop movement. American and French soldiers marched through New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Local communities cheered as the army passed through towns and villages. Many civilians had not seen Continental soldiers in years. The sight of disciplined troops marching alongside French allies filled people with hope. The deception worked perfectly. British commanders in New York remained convinced they were the target. By the time they realized Washington's true intention, it was too late. Cornwallis found himself trapped at Yorktown with no way to escape by land or sea. The siege began in September. American and French artillery pounded British positions day and night. Cornwallis's situation grew desperate as supplies ran low and his men fell sick. On October 19, 1781, the British general finally surrendered. As his troops marched out to lay down their weapons, a British band played "The World Turned Upside Down." Victory did not bring immediate peace. Negotiations with Britain dragged on for 2 years. During this tense period, Washington faced perhaps his greatest test of leadership. Unpaid Continental officers gathered at Newburgh, New York, threatening to march on Congress and seize control of the government. Washington addressed the angry officers personally. He pulled out a letter from Congress and struggled to read it. Then he put on his spectacles, saying he had grown gray and nearly blind in service to his country. This simple gesture moved the officers to tears. The conspiracy collapsed immediately. When the Treaty of Paris was finally signed in 1783, Washington made his most important decision. He voluntarily resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief and returned to private life at Mount Vernon. King George III called this act the greatest in the history of the world. Washington's resignation established a powerful precedent that military leaders serve civilian authority. This final act completed his transformation from colonial planter to the father of a new nation. Chapter 3: Architect of a New Nation, 1787 to 1789. Part 1: The Constitutional Convention and National Leadership, 1787. By 1787, the American experiment seemed on the verge of collapse. The Articles of Confederation had created a government so weak it could barely function. States printed their own money, leading to economic chaos. Trade wars broke out between neighboring states. The federal government could not collect taxes or pay its debts from the Revolutionary War. Veterans went unpaid while foreign creditors demanded their money. Something had to change, and fast. Leaders across the nation knew they needed a stronger government, but they feared creating something too powerful. Many Americans had just fought a war to escape the tyranny of King George. They did not want to replace him with their own version of a dictator. Into this crisis stepped George Washington, reluctantly. He had retired to Mount Vernon after the war, hoping to live quietly as a gentleman farmer. But his fellow Virginians begged him to attend a convention in Philadelphia. They knew his presence would give the gathering instant credibility. Without Washington, many states might refuse to send delegates at all. Washington arrived in Philadelphia in May 1787, greeted by cheering crowds and artillery salutes. The delegates immediately elected him president of the convention by unanimous vote. This was no accident. Everyone understood that Washington's reputation would legitimize whatever they created. If he supported the new government, the people would trust it. Throughout the sweltering Philadelphia summer, Washington said very little during debates. He sat in his chair at the front of the room, watching and listening as brilliant minds like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton argued over every detail. Benjamin Franklin, despite his age, helped broker compromises when tempers flared. The delegates fought over representation, slavery, and the powers of the federal government. Washington's silence spoke louder than words. His mere presence kept delegates from walking out when discussions grew heated. Several times. The convention nearly collapsed as states threatened to leave, but each time, delegates looked at Washington and remembered why they were there. They trusted him completely, knowing he had given up power before and would do so again. The Constitution that emerged from these debates created a government unlike any in history. It balanced power between large and small states, between federal and state authority, between different branches of government. Washington's steady leadership had made it possible to turn 13 quarreling states into one united nation. When the convention ended in September, the real work began. The Constitution needed approval from 9 states to take effect. Washington's support proved crucial in winning ratification. His name carried such weight that many Americans supported the new government simply because he endorsed it. The stage was now set for Washington to lead this new nation as its first president, a role he never wanted but could not refuse. Part 2. Inauguration as First President, 1789. The Constitution was now law, but turning words on paper into a working government required someone the nation trusted completely. When electors gathered across the 13 states in early 1789, their choice was unanimous. George Washington would be the first president of the United States. He received every single electoral vote, a feat no president would ever repeat. Washington learned of his victory while tending his beloved Mount Vernon. The news filled him with dread rather than joy. He knew that every action he took would create rules for future presidents to follow. There was no guidebook, no tradition to lean on. He would have to invent the presidency as he went along. The journey from Virginia to New York City became something no one expected. In every town along the route, crowds gathered to see their new president. Church bells rang, cannons fired salutes, and children threw flower petals in the streets. Washington rode through this celebration, feeling the enormous weight of a nation's hopes on his shoulders. New York buzzed with excitement as Inauguration Day approached. April 30th, 1789, dawned clear and bright. Federal Hall, a modest building on Wall Street, would witness history. A wooden balcony overlooked the street where hundreds of citizens waited below. This was democracy in action, not in a palace or cathedral, but on a simple city street where ordinary people could watch. Washington appeared on the balcony, wearing a plain brown suit made of American cloth. His hands trembled slightly as he placed his right hand on a Bible borrowed from a nearby lodge. Robert Livingston, Chancellor of New York, administered the oath. Washington's voice was barely audible as he promised to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Then he bent down and kissed the Bible, whispering, "So help me God," words not required by law, but spoken from his heart. The crowd below erupted in cheers. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, the peaceful transfer of power to a leader chosen by the people rather than born to rule. Washington bowed to the crowd, his face serious and thoughtful. Inside Federal Hall, Washington delivered his inaugural address to Congress. His voice shook with emotion as he spoke of the great experiment they were beginning together. He asked for divine guidance and promised to serve with honor. The speech was short but profound, setting a tone of humility that would define his presidency. As the ceremony ended, Washington stood at the threshold of an impossible task. He had to prove that a republic could work, that people could govern themselves without kings or nobles. Every decision he made would echo through history. The weight of creating precedent for an entire system of government now rested on his shoulders, and the real work was just beginning. Part 3. Establishing Federal Authority and Precedents, 1789 to 1791. Washington's inauguration had marked the beginning, but now came the harder task of making the presidency work. No one had ever built a federal government from scratch, and Washington knew every choice he made would shape how future presidents would lead. He faced a mountain of decisions with no guidebook to follow. The Constitution outlined the basic structure, but it left many details blank. Washington had to figure out how to actually run the executive branch day by day. He started by creating the first presidential cabinet, bringing together three brilliant but very different men. For Secretary of State, he chose Thomas Jefferson, the diplomat and author of the Declaration of Independence. Alexander Hamilton became Secretary of the Treasury, the young financial genius who understood money and markets. Henry Knox took charge as Secretary of War, Washington's trusted friend from their military days. These cabinet meetings became Washington's way of making major decisions. The Constitution never mentioned such a group, but Washington saw the wisdom in getting advice from experts. He would listen to their arguments, weigh their different viewpoints, and then decide. This practice of cabinet government became so useful that every president since has followed the same pattern. Washington also had to decide how a president should act in public. Should he be formal like a king or casual like a common citizen? He chose a middle path. He held weekly receptions where any properly dressed citizen could meet him, showing democratic openness. But he maintained dignity through careful ceremony and proper dress. He rode in a fine carriage and lived in an elegant house, but he avoided the golden crowns and royal titles that European rulers used. The new president faced his first major test when Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789. This law created the entire federal court system, something the Constitution required but never detailed. Washington signed it, establishing courts that could enforce federal laws across all states. He appointed the first judges, including John Jay as Chief Justice, knowing these men would interpret the Constitution for generations. Economic problems demanded immediate attention. The states owed millions from the Revolutionary War, and foreign nations wondered if America could pay its debts. Washington supported Hamilton's bold plan to have the federal government take over all state debts and pay them in full. Many opposed this expensive idea, but Washington understood that America needed to prove its financial reliability to survive. Throughout these early years, Washington set the tone for presidential behavior. He used his veto power only twice, showing restraint. He worked closely with Congress, but maintained executive independence. He avoided taking sides in the growing political disputes between Hamilton and Jefferson, trying to stay above party politics. By 1791, the basic machinery of federal government was running. Washington had created departments, courts, and procedures that transformed words on paper into a working system. His careful balance of authority and restraint had proven that a president could lead effectively without becoming a dictator. The precedents he established would guide the nation through the challenges that lay ahead. Part 4. Securing the nation's future capital and economy, 1790. By early 1790, the new government faced a crisis that threatened to tear apart everything Washington had helped build. Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant but ambitious Secretary of Treasury, proposed a bold financial plan. The federal government would take on all the debts that individual states had accumulated during the Revolutionary War. This meant the national government would pay back millions of dollars owed by states like Massachusetts and South Carolina. The proposal split the nation down the middle. Northern states, which still owed large sums from the war, loved the idea. Southern states had already paid off most of their debts and saw no reason to help their northern neighbors. Virginia's Thomas Jefferson and James Madison led the opposition, arguing that Hamilton's plan would reward states that had been careless with money while punishing those that had been responsible. At the same time, Congress faced another heated debate about where to put the permanent national capital. Northern cities like New York and Philadelphia wanted the honor and the economic benefits that would come with it. Southern leaders insisted the capital should be located in their region to balance Northern commercial power. By summer 1790, these fights had brought government business to a standstill. Congressmen shouted at each other in the halls. Some threatened that their states might leave the Union if they didn't get their way. Washington watched with growing alarm as the fragile coalition he had helped forge began to crack. The solution came through a private dinner arranged by Jefferson. Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison sat down to hammer out a deal that would save the government from collapse. Hamilton would get his financial plan, but in return, the permanent capital would be built along the Potomac River between Maryland and Virginia. This location pleased Washington immensely, as it sat just miles from his beloved Mount Vernon. The compromise required each man to swallow something bitter. Hamilton had to accept that the capital would be in the South. Jefferson and Madison had to support a financial system they believed favored wealthy merchants over ordinary farmers. But all three understood that failure to reach an agreement could destroy the young nation. Washington threw his full weight behind the deal. He used his influence with Southern legislators, convincing them that Hamilton's economic policies would strengthen the entire country. He also personally oversaw the selection of the exact site for the new capital, riding through the area and meeting with local landowners. The Residence Act passed in July 1790, creating the District of Columbia. Hamilton's financial plan also squeaked through Congress. Within months, the nation's credit improved dramatically. Foreign investors began buying American bonds again. Trade increased as merchants gained confidence in the government's stability. This episode revealed Washington's greatest political skill. He understood that leadership sometimes meant supporting policies he didn't completely agree with for the greater good. The Compromise of 1790 demonstrated that the new Constitution could handle major disputes without violence or dissolution. It also showed that pragmatic deal-making, not rigid ideology, would be essential for the Republic's survival. Chapter 4. Trials of the Presidency, 1791 to 1797. Part 1. The Whiskey Rebellion and Domestic Challenges, 1791 to 1794. By 1791, President Washington faced a crisis that would test everything the new nation stood for. Deep in the mountains of western Pennsylvania, farmers were seething with anger over a new tax on whiskey. The government needed money to pay off its debts. So, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton had proposed taxing distilled spirits. To these frontier families, whiskey was more than just a drink. It was their main source of income and the easiest way to transport their grain crops over rough mountain roads. The farmers saw the tax as another form of tyranny, just like the British taxes they had fought against in the Revolution. They had risked their lives for freedom from unfair taxation, and now their own government was doing the same thing. The tax collectors who came to enforce the law faced a hostile reception. Some were tarred and feathered, others were beaten and chased out of town. The farmers organized protests and refused to pay. Washington watched the situation carefully. He understood the farmers' anger, but he also knew that if the federal government backed down, it would show weakness. Other groups might decide they could ignore laws they didn't like. The Articles of Confederation had failed partly because the government couldn't enforce its decisions. The new Constitution had to be different. By 1794, the rebellion had grown dangerous. Armed groups were attacking federal officials and threatening to march on Pittsburgh. Some rebels talked about breaking away from the United States entirely. Washington knew he had to act, but he wanted to avoid bloodshed if possible. He tried negotiation first, sending commissioners to meet with the rebels and offering pardons to those who would submit to federal law. When talks failed, Washington made a historic decision. He would personally lead an army into Pennsylvania to restore order. No sitting president had ever commanded troops in the field before. At age 62, Washington mounted his horse and rode west at the head of nearly 13,000 militiamen from several states. The sight of this massive force, led by the hero of the revolution himself, shocked the rebels into submission. The rebellion collapsed without a major battle. Most of the leaders fled or surrendered. Washington pardoned the few rebels who were captured, showing mercy while demonstrating strength. The message was clear. The federal government would enforce its laws, but it would not become a tyranny itself. This crisis proved that the Constitution could work. Unlike the weak government under the Articles, the new federal system had both the power and the will to maintain order. Washington had shown that a republic could be strong without being oppressive. The peaceful resolution also demonstrated that disagreements could be settled through law rather than violence. The Whiskey Rebellion became a turning point in American history. It established the principle that no group could simply ignore federal law because they disagreed with it. At the same time, it showed that the government would use force only as a last resort. Washington's handling of the crisis strengthened both the Constitution and the young nation's confidence in its institutions. Part 2. Navigating the Northwest Indian War and Western Expansion, 1791 to 1794. As Washington grappled with domestic rebellion in Pennsylvania, an even more serious crisis was brewing on the western frontier. Beyond the Appalachian Mountains, in what is now Ohio and Indiana, Native American tribes were fighting desperately to protect their homelands from American settlers streaming westward. The British, still smarting from their defeat in the Revolutionary War, quietly supported these tribes from their forts in Canada, hoping to limit American expansion and perhaps reclaim lost territory. The situation had already turned deadly. In 1790, General Josiah Harmar led an expedition into the Northwest Territory to crush Native resistance. The mission ended in disaster when warriors led by chiefs like Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee outmaneuvered and defeated American forces. The following year, General Arthur St. Clair marched north with a larger army, confident he could succeed where Harmar had failed. On a cold November morning in 1791, Native warriors launched a surprise attack that became the worst military defeat in American history up to that point. Over 600 soldiers died, and St. Clair barely escaped with his life. These defeats shocked Washington and exposed dangerous weaknesses in America's military. The army was poorly trained, badly equipped, and led by officers who underestimated their opponents. Meanwhile, each defeat emboldened the Native Confederation and convinced the British that Americans might be driven back across the mountains. Washington knew he had to act decisively or risk losing the entire Northwest Territory. Washington completely reorganized the military, creating what he called the Legion of the United States. He appointed General Anthony Wayne, a Revolutionary War veteran known for his aggressive tactics, to lead this new force. Wayne spent 2 years training his men rigorously, teaching them discipline and frontier warfare. Unlike his predecessors, Wayne respected his native opponents and prepared carefully for the challenges ahead. In August 1794, Wayne's well-trained legion finally met the Native Confederation at a place called Falling Timbers, where a tornado had knocked down trees across the battlefield. The warriors expected to use the fallen logs as cover, but Wayne adapted his tactics and won a decisive victory. The defeat shattered Native resistance and forced the British to abandon their allies, retreating to their Canadian forts. The victory led to the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which opened most of present-day Ohio to American settlement. Washington had proven that the United States could defend its territorial claims and project power across vast distances. However, the success came at a terrible cost to Native peoples, who lost ancestral lands and faced an uncertain future as American expansion continued westward. Part 3. Foreign Policy and Diplomatic Maneuvers, 1793 to 1795. As Washington celebrated victory over native forces in Ohio, events across the Atlantic Ocean threatened to drag his young nation into another devastating war. Revolutionary France had executed its king and declared war on most of Europe, including Britain. The bloody chaos in Paris horrified many Americans, while others cheered for the cause of freedom. This split created a dangerous problem for Washington. In April 1793, Washington made a bold decision. He issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, declaring that America would stay out of European wars. This shocked many citizens who remembered French help during the Revolution. Thomas Jefferson and his followers wanted to support France, while Alexander Hamilton pushed for closer ties with Britain. Washington ignored both sides and chose America's interests first. The neutrality policy helped American merchants sell goods to both warring sides, bringing wealth to the new nation. Ships loaded with grain, lumber, and other supplies sailed from American ports to feed hungry armies across Europe. But this success created new dangers. British warships began stopping American vessels and forcing sailors into the Royal Navy. They claimed these men were British deserters, but many were American citizens torn from their families. By 1794, anger against Britain reached a boiling point. Merchants lost fortunes when the British seized their ships. Sailors disappeared into foreign naval service. Many Americans demanded war to defend their honor. Washington faced a terrible choice between fighting the world's most powerful navy or appearing weak before his own people. Instead of choosing war, Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to London to negotiate. The resulting Jay Treaty sparked fierce debate across America. Jay secured British withdrawal from western forts and opened some trade routes, but failed to stop the seizure of American sailors. Opposition newspapers called Jay a traitor and burned him in effigy. Even Washington's supporters worried the treaty gave too much to Britain. Despite the outcry, Washington signed the treaty in 1795. He knew it prevented a war that could destroy the fragile nation. The British removed their troops from American soil, ending their support for native resistance. Trade expanded, filling government coffers with customs revenue. Most importantly, America avoided being crushed between the European powers. Spain, watching America grow stronger, decided to make its own deal. The Treaty of San Lorenzo gave Americans the right to ship goods down the Mississippi River and use the port of New Orleans. Western farmers could now sell their crops to distant markets, transforming the frontier economy. Washington's careful diplomacy had worked. America remained independent while European nations tore each other apart. The president had proven that a small nation could survive by staying neutral and making smart deals. His approach would guide American foreign policy for generations, showing that sometimes the bravest choice is refusing to fight. Part 4. Setting the Two-Term Precedent and Retirement Decision, 1796 to 1797. By 1796, George Washington felt the weight of 8 years in office pressing down on him. The constant battles between political parties wore on his spirit. Every decision sparked fierce arguments between Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. The president who had once unified the nation now watched helplessly as it split into angry factions. Washington made a choice that shocked many of his supporters. He would not run for a third term. Friends and allies begged him to reconsider. They argued that only he could hold the young republic together. But Washington had seen enough. He believed that staying too long would make him look like a king rather than a servant of the people. Working closely with Alexander Hamilton, Washington crafted his farewell address. This wasn't just a goodbye letter. It was his final gift to the American people, a warning about the dangers ahead. He wrote about the poison of political parties, how they could tear the nation apart. He warned against letting regional differences destroy national unity. Most importantly, Washington spoke about foreign alliances. America should trade with everyone, but avoid permanent partnerships that could drag the country into European wars. His words would guide American foreign policy for over a century. On September 19, 1796, newspapers across the country published Washington's address. People gathered in taverns and town squares to hear it read aloud. Many wept as they realized their greatest leader was truly stepping down. Washington's decision created something unprecedented in world history. Kings ruled until they died. Dictators held power as long as they could. But here was the most powerful man in America voluntarily walking away from office. He proved that in a republic, no one person was bigger than the nation itself. The peaceful transfer of power to John Adams in March 1797 amazed foreign observers. No armies marched, no blood was spilled. Washington simply handed over the presidency and rode back to Mount Vernon. European monarchs couldn't believe what they were seeing. This moment changed everything. Washington's two-term limit became an unwritten rule that every president followed until Franklin Roosevelt. Even then, Americans felt so strongly about it that they made it official law with the 22nd Amendment in 1951. As Washington returned to his beloved plantation, he left behind more than just a stable government. He had shown the world that democracy could work, that power could change hands peacefully, and that true leadership sometimes meant knowing when to step aside. His retirement proved that America was different from every other nation on earth. Chapter 5. Legacy of First in War and Peace, 1797 to 1799 and beyond. Part 1. Return to Mount Vernon and Final Years, 1797 to 1799. The carriages rolled away from Philadelphia for the last time in March 1797, carrying Washington back to the red brick mansion he had called home for decades. After 8 years as president, the man who could have been king was finally free to be a farmer again. Mount Vernon stretched across the Potomac's banks, its fields and gardens calling to him with a peace he had not known since before the Revolution. Washington threw himself into the work he loved most. He rose before dawn to ride across his 5 farms, checking crops and livestock with the same attention he once gave to military campaigns. He tested new farming methods, planted different crops, and kept detailed records of everything from weather patterns to soil conditions. His letters to friends buzzed with excitement about crop rotation and fertilizer experiments. This was not the tired retreat of an old man, but the energetic pursuit of a lifelong passion. Yet even at Mount Vernon, the weight of being George Washington never fully lifted from his shoulders. Letters arrived daily from across the young nation, seeking his advice on everything from political disputes to business ventures. Visitors streamed to his door, some traveling from distant states just to shake his hand. Martha often complained that they lived like innkeepers, always entertaining guests who came to see the famous general. The crisis with France in 1798 proved that Washington could never truly step away from public service. French ships were seizing American vessels, and war seemed likely. President Adams faced enormous pressure from both sides of the political divide. In desperation, he asked Washington to command the army once more. At 66, Washington accepted the appointment as lieutenant general, though he insisted on staying at Mount Vernon and letting younger officers handle daily operations. This decision revealed the essence of the man Washington had become. He would answer his country's call, but only on terms that made sense for his age and circumstances. He spent months organizing the army from his study, writing letters to recruit officers and plan defenses. When tensions cooled and the crisis passed, he stepped back again without complaint or self-promotion. The throat infection struck quickly in December 1799. Washington had ridden his estate on a cold, wet day, checking fences and planning improvements. By evening, he complained of soreness, and within days the illness had taken hold. Doctors tried their treatments, but nothing helped. Washington faced death with the same calm determination he had brought to every crisis. He died on December 14th, surrounded by Martha and close friends. News of his passing spread like wildfire across the nation and beyond. Church bells tolled in cities, from Boston to Savannah. Congress suspended business for weeks of mourning. Even enemies like Napoleon ordered French ships to lower their flags. Washington's death marked not just the end of a remarkable life, but the first real test of whether the nation he had helped create could survive without its most essential figure. Part 2. Farewell to a Nation and Symbol of Unity, 1799. The news traveled with shocking speed across a young nation that had never known life without its founding father. Riders galloped through winter snow to carry word that George Washington had died on December 14th at Mount Vernon. Within days, every major city from Boston to Charleston learned that the man who had led them through revolution and guided them through their first uncertain years as a republic was gone. President John Adams received the devastating news and immediately ordered government offices closed. Congress, despite bitter political divisions between Federalists and Republicans, united in grief. Members who had spent months arguing over policy now stood together drafting resolutions of mourning. Adams himself, though he had disagreed with Washington on many issues, proclaimed that the nation had lost its greatest citizen. The funeral at Mount Vernon was simple, as Washington had requested. Martha Washington, dressed in black, watched as her husband's body was laid to rest in the family vault. Only close friends and neighbors attended this private ceremony. But across the nation, grand public memorials filled churches and town squares. In Philadelphia, mock funeral processions stretched for miles. Citizens wore black armbands and draped their homes in mourning cloth. What surprised many was how the world reacted. British ships lowered their flags to half-mast, honoring the man who had defeated them in war. French naval vessels followed suit, despite ongoing tensions with America. Napoleon himself ordered 10 days of mourning, recognizing Washington as a leader who had changed how nations could govern themselves. Even enemies acknowledged that something remarkable had ended. The eulogies poured in from every corner of the country. Henry Lee's famous words captured the national feeling: first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Newspapers that usually attacked each other's political views agreed on one thing: America had lost its most essential figure. Yet something remarkable happened in those dark December days. The government continued functioning. Congress met. Courts remained open. The presidency, now held by Adams, carried on without crisis. Washington's greatest achievement became clear, not in his life, but in his death. He had built a system strong enough to survive without him. The mourning period revealed how deeply Washington had woven himself into the nation's identity. Political enemies who had spent years fighting each other found common ground in honoring his memory. The unity his death inspired proved that his influence extended far beyond his official roles as general and president. As winter turned to spring, Americans began to understand that Washington's true legacy lay not in what he had done, but in what he had made possible. The institutions he had helped create were proving they could endure. And the example he had set would guide leaders for generations to come. Part 3. The enduring example of public service. As Americans grappled with the loss of their first president, something remarkable began to emerge from their grief. Washington had done more than lead armies or govern a nation. He had shown them what it meant to serve without seeking to rule forever. Throughout his life, Washington faced moments when he could have seized absolute power. After winning the Revolutionary War, some officers whispered about making him king. He rejected the idea completely. When his presidency ended, he simply walked away from the highest office in the land. No one forced him to leave. He chose to step down because he believed the country needed to prove that power could change hands peacefully. This pattern of behavior created something new in the world. Leaders before Washington often held power until death took it from them. Kings ruled for life. Generals became dictators. But Washington showed that a person could lead with strength while still respecting limits. He listened to advisors even when he disagreed. He followed laws even when they frustrated him. He treated political opponents with dignity even when they attacked him personally. Young officers who served under Washington carried his example into their own careers. They learned that true leadership meant restraint, not just boldness. Future presidents studied how Washington handled crises, noting his careful deliberation before major decisions. Military leaders adopted his approach of firm command mixed with respect for civilian authority. The impact spread beyond government halls. Teachers told children stories of Washington's honesty and self-sacrifice. Ministers preached about his moral character. Citizens began to expect their leaders to measure themselves against his standard. The idea took root that public service meant putting the common good ahead of personal gain. When other nations struggled with their own revolutions, they looked to Washington as proof that democracy could work without collapsing into chaos. European thinkers had predicted that America would either split apart or fall under military rule. Washington's example helped prove them wrong. He demonstrated that people could govern themselves if they had leaders willing to serve rather than dominate. Even Washington's flaws contributed to his lasting influence. He owned slaves, struggled with his temper, and made political mistakes. These human weaknesses made his achievements more meaningful, not less. He showed that imperfect people could still rise to meet extraordinary challenges when they put principle above convenience. As decades passed, Washington's image became woven into the fabric of American identity. His face appeared on money and monuments. His words were quoted in speeches. His birthday became a national holiday. But more importantly, his example continued to shape how Americans thought about leadership and duty. The standard Washington set proved durable because it addressed a fundamental challenge of democracy. How do you give people enough power to lead effectively while ensuring they don't abuse that power? Washington's answer was character. He showed that the best protection against tyranny was not complex laws or elaborate systems, but leaders who chose to limit themselves. Part 4. George Washington in History and Memory. The story of how Americans remembered George Washington began almost before he was gone. Within months of his death in 1799, writers started crafting his legend. Mason Weems, a traveling preacher and bookseller, published the first popular biography in 1806. His little book told the famous story of young George chopping down his father's cherry tree and confessing, "I cannot tell a lie." The tale was pure invention, but it stuck. Americans wanted their first president to be perfect. For the next century, Washington grew larger than life in American minds. School children memorized poems about his bravery. Artists painted him crossing the Delaware River, standing heroically in his boat. Towns and counties across the expanding nation took his name. In 1885, Americans completed the Washington Monument, a towering white obelisk that could be seen for miles across the capital city named for him. His face appeared on the $1 bill and the quarter, making him part of daily life for every American. The myths served a purpose. A young nation needed heroes to hold it together. Washington became that unifying figure, someone both North and South could claim with pride. During the Civil War, both sides invoked his memory. Abraham Lincoln often quoted Washington's farewell address, while Confederate leaders insisted they were following his example by resisting federal tyranny. But the 20th century brought harder questions. Professional historians began digging deeper into Washington's life. They found a more complex man than the marble statue suggested. He owned hundreds of enslaved people at Mount Vernon. He could be vain about his appearance and touchy about his reputation. He sometimes lost his temper spectacularly, swearing like the soldier he had been. These discoveries didn't destroy Washington's reputation, but they changed it. Modern Americans learned to see him as human rather than divine. The Civil Rights Movement forced honest conversation about his role as a slaveholder. Some schools stopped teaching the cherry tree story, focusing instead on his real accomplishments and real failures. Today, Washington remains central to American identity, but in a different way. He appears on currency and monuments, but Americans debate what he represents. Some see him as proof that great leaders can rise above their times. Others point to his ownership of enslaved people as evidence that even heroes can be complicit in great wrongs. Perhaps this ongoing conversation is Washington's most important legacy. He gave Americans not just a model of leadership, but a standard to measure all leaders against. Each generation rediscovers him anew, finding in his story both inspiration and cautionary lessons. The man who refused to be king became something more lasting, a mirror in which Americans continue to examine themselves and their highest ideals.